Hi everyone, my name is Courtney, and today I'm going to be talking about something a little different than you, only because I had a different schooling experience than you guys, and I didn't quite feel like any of my embalmings were overly profound or life-changing to the point where I can talk about it for 15 minutes. So, I wanted to share something a little more informational and useful to anyone who is about to spend their life working in the death industry, especially here in America. So, today I'm going to be comparing and contrasting the spiritual worldview versus the scientific worldview in relation to death and funeral practices around the globe. I've selected the traditional funeral in our culture, the funeral of the Torohan people in Indonesia, Famadihana in Madagascar, and the Tibetan monk sky burials. Now, as a student studying funeral services and having been around death, I've always been rather curious about how we view death in our country and why we have the type of after death rituals that we have here. I've come to my own personal conclusion that as humans, we fear decomposition and death in its entirety. When you ask someone what their biggest fear is, it's pretty likely you'll get an answer like dying or losing someone I love. Now, it's one thing to lose someone you love, but to think of their body rotting below the surface is unfathomable to most. This has to be the reason we do what we do, and we choose to embalm and pick the most airtight caskets and vaults and hold these very sort of quick and serious funerals to say goodbye, right? To me, this connect we think we have to our deceased almost seems like a disconnect, especially when we compare to some of the other practices around the world. So, anyone who's going into the industry is obviously aware of the traditional American funeral and how it goes. I know for me in mortuary school, we didn't talk much about other countries or cultures, except for in the early days, like the Egyptians and the Romans and so on. Um, but this really wasn't fulfilling for me, since I've always had a strong interest in learning more about the funeral practices in other parts of the world and how we can relate to them or not. And not to my surprise, there are parts of the world that view death very differently than we do. So, I'd just like to begin briefly talking about the funeral and after death practices of the ancient Egyptians, since they also believed in preserving their loved ones, much like us. And it shows that preservation of the deceased has been practiced for a very long time. Now, they did believe in the afterlife and made sure the deceased was well prepared for it by entombing them with their most prized possessions and treasures. And they really wanted to ensure a safe passage into the next world, which is why they were mummified. So basically, respectable funerals have always been a thing in any of the histories that I've learned about or studied. Now, let's talk about our funerals here in America briefly. The rundown of our process, as you know, is death, first call, pickup, planning, embalming, dressing, casketing, wake, funeral, burial. It's pretty cut and dry, and once the body is buried, the end. You won't ever see your loved one again. I recently read a really great book called When We Die by Cedric Mims, which is divided into about 16 chapters and gives a breakdown of just about everything you need to know about death and dying and what comes with it. In one of his later chapters about mourning and grieving, while talking about our traditional funerals here in America, he says, death is acknowledged as real and final. For us, visiting the cemetery where our loved ones is buried is kind of our only ritual to continue honoring the dead and sort of a way to cherish the memory of the life they once lived. But it pretty much ends there. The memory of them is mostly just a memory locked in your head or memorabilia or photos. And some people hold anniversaries or memorials for the deceased, but not much more. To me, this seems short. We spend very little time with the body after they die, and we hand it off to someone else to clean and preserve and care for, someone that we probably don't know very well, and then we say goodbye. The end. So, is it our own personal fear of death that created the need to get rid of the body as fast as possible? I felt the best way to explain our disconnect is by showing you the connection that other cultures have with the deceased. First, I'd like to talk about Sulawesi, Indonesia. You may have seen this on the news or on Facebook at one point, and it's surely the type of funeral that you can't forget. Now, for us, when our loved ones die, the first thing we do is call our local funeral home to arrange for a pickup. For the Torahan people of Sulawesi, it goes very differently. After you die in this culture, you are kept in the house up until your funeral. Now, that doesn't sound so wild yet. In an article titled Death Doesn't Mean Goodbye, the author Amanda Bennett says that late loved ones are tended at home for weeks, months, or even years after death. Can you imagine how bizarre that would be here in our country, where people view dead bodies as unsanitary, unsafe, and quite scary? I'm sure if the police found out you were storing, feeding, and still talking to your deceased family member, you would be put in jail or the psych ward, much like Norman Bates from Psycho. Now, this is where the spiritual versus scientific worldviews come into play big time. Now, Westerners didn't always have a scientific worldview, and that actually really didn't come into play until about 400 years ago, which is relatively new if you ask me. So here in the US, where our outlook is scientific, it's as simple as there's no pulse, you're dead. Next comes the funeral, end of story. Jason Hugh, who's a travel writer, while talking about the Torahan, he says, Western habit of sweeping the dead out of sight within days or even hours of death would seem far too abrupt to the Torahan. Something we never really stop to think about is just how quickly death is taken care of here, and it keeps death in that sort of taboo category that nobody really wants to talk about or face. For the Torahan, their love for you remains the same as it was when you had a pulse, and you remain part of the family while still receiving all meals and visits during the day. For them, they refer to the deceased as sick, and they continue to tend to them as if they were really ill. Now, they do preserve their dead while the funerals are planned, and they typically do this by pouring alcohol into the nose, the eyes, the ears, and the mouth, and they also use some other oils and substances to mummify them. Now, the reason their funerals are put off for so long is so that family from far away can travel into town, and so that families with very little money can raise enough to hold an extravagant funeral. Much like our culture, funerals are expensive, and some tend to be more of a social status symbol, showing the wealth of the deceased and or the family. And though our money is spent on different things like funeral home services, caskets, cemetery services, etc., for them it's spent on feasting supplies, ceremony supplies, livestock for slaughter, and so on. I think an important contrast between their culture and ours is that they see death as more of a step in life's journey, rather than us, where we see it as the end of life's journey. They believe that people aren't really dead when they die, and that a profound human connection lasts well past death. Now, this may be true for some people here in our country who believe in spirits and angels and seeing mediums or anything like that, but the difference really shows in how we care for the deceased's remains. In both cultures, it's nothing short of utmost respect. For them, what may be respectful may seem disrespectful to us based on how we've always done traditional funerals here. Unlike our funerals, which typically end when the body is buried, the Torahan have grand funerals lasting many days. During this time, every distant relative comes to town. There are all sorts of rituals, meals, receptions, entertainment, prayers. throughout the week leading up to the burial. Their funerals can be compared to a party such as a wedding, and apparently they're quite fun and very enjoyable by everyone in town. Now for us, funerals for our loved ones are usually quite difficult since it's the final goodbye. But for the Torohan, that funeral is not the final one. Some of the Torohan actually exhume their loved ones every few years to dress them in fresh clothes, accessories, bring them snacks, cigarettes, let them get some sun, and see the family. This is known as the second funeral, or the Maneen, which is the ceremony of cleaning corpses. Again, this shows you that life does not end after death for them, and that the deceased are still treated as one of the living. The fear we have towards death doesn't exist for them. Of course, there is no doubt that the Torohan grieve their dead just like we do, and just like other cultures around the world. Now, there is another culture where a second funeral takes place, and this is during the ritual of Famadihana, or turning of bones, in Madagascar. They also exhume the body to freshen it up and have some similar celebrations during the time while the body is out of the ground. They do this so that their loved one will be remembered forever. These celebrations include feasting, drinking, and dancing with the deceased, and they hold a deep significance to honoring their dead ancestors. Now, the last cross-cultural funeral I'd like to speak about is the Buddhist monk sky burials in Tibet. Now, for them, they see the body as a shell which housed the soul. And since your soul would have moved on and been reincarnated, it's just a body. So after death, when the soul has moved on, they actually feed the body to vultures. This is a practice which may seem pretty brutal to us, but their reasoning behind it is actually quite beautiful. It's a very respectful matter, and it's considered an honor to have your body fed to the birds. Basically, to sustain more life by giving yours. They wish to be as generous as they can be and also environmentally conscious, which is one of the reasons they do this. They are spiritual, and they consider it good if the birds eat your entire body. If they don't, they assume it's because you had been bad or evil during your lifetime. And the body of the deceased is prayed over for a few days prior to the funeral, but the family actually doesn't attend the funeral at all once the body's taken away to the birds. So in a way, it's much like our culture where the actual body is gone once the funeral happens. There's no seeing them again. And though their funerals seem to be cut and dry, you're eaten, and it's over, there is a lot more meaning behind it. In America, we are taught, and more so forced, to move on from grief after a loved one dies. Almost like, okay, it's time to go back to work, you have stuff to do, or maybe you need to see a therapist. The truth is, there is no set time for grieving, and everyone goes through it differently. I think for these cultures and how they view death, it gives them a chance to live out their grief and celebrate their loved ones in a way that keeps them alive or gives life to something else. If any of you have taken Dr. Fessler's cross-cultural psychology class, you would have learned that some parts of the planet are living in a spiritual world, while others like us are living in a scientific world. Not necessarily is living in a scientific world a bad thing, but it's important to realize that in other parts of the world, people are seeing life in a much more connected way, rather than how we see life as a world of atoms and molecules and finality. It's interesting to see how funeral practices are starting to change here in the US. For example, the rise of green burial and home funerals and even open pyre funerals somewhere in Colorado. It's unlikely that any change would happen abruptly, since our practices have been rather traditional here for some time. Surely we won't be digging up our loved ones for festivals and feasts anytime soon, but it seems like now is as good as ever to study death in other cultures in order to have a more evolved approach to death and grieving in our own culture. Also, while working in the death industry, we will be faced with people from all different backgrounds and histories, and it's vital to keep an open mind and maybe work towards a change which would help our culture fear death less. Thank you so much for listening. I hope this was informative and enjoyable.